Nebuchadnezzar's statue. This event is strange, as this is when King Nebuchadnezzar saw Jesus. Imagine you're a king 603 years before Christ, and you saw Jesus face to face. What would you do? Many people don't even know that Jesus was in the Old Testament. This event occurs in the book of Daniel. The events of the book take place in Babylon, a region that was ruled by Nebuchadnezzar, who was a proud and cruel tyrant who took great pleasure in torturing his victims. He ruled the ancient world as an absolute dictator. After subduing Assyria, he set his sights on Egypt, his principal adversary at the time. Because Judah was in the way, it would be necessary to get rid of it if he wanted to fulfill his ambition of ruling over a large empire. Nebuchadnezzar issued an order to have a large number of Jewish young men trained to serve him in the capacity of men of knowledge and wisdom. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were among those who were taken captive. They were known by the names Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Chaldean. The image of God. King Nebuchadnezzar gave the order for the creation of a colossal statue made of gold. The gold statue that Nebuchadnezzar had commissioned must have been magnificent. It stood 90 feet tall. It's possible that the king planned it so that he could consolidate his power by bringing together all levels of his officials for a grand ceremony. These rulers were to attend the dedication of the statue erected by King Nebuchadnezzar and fall face down in worship of it. Everyone who disobeyed this command ran the risk of being cast into a burning furnace and being burnt to a crisp. Everyone obeyed Nebuchadnezzar's orders because he was determined to establish himself not only as the uncontested political leader of Babylon, but also as the supreme religious authority in the city, or at the very least, almost everyone. Due to the fact that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were among the officials that were present at the massive gathering, a confrontation was unavoidable. 3 of the men in the room did not bow down, even though everyone else in the room did. Many people cannot imagine that social pressure. It was not an easy fit. When Nebuchadnezzar found out about the situation, he immediately flew into a rage. It's surprising that he gave the accused a chance to respond to the charges leveled against them. That he did may indicate his regard for them. But make no mistake, the king would accept only one response: total concession. They had 2 options: either worship the enormous gold idol or perish in the fire. Despite his earlier praise for the Hebrew God, Nebuchadnezzar added, "Who is the God who can deliver you from my power?" The king's question, as before, would be answered eventually. Daniel 3:13-14. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, gave a command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image which I have set up?" These valiant Jewish men defied the king's direct order and placed themselves in the hands of God. Their response is quite impressive. Daniel 3:16-18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up." In other words, they said, "We'd rather fear our God than your furnace any day. Even if he decided to let us burn, we will still serve the living God rather than your dead idol." Priceless. They preferred death to unfaithfulness to God, and had no doubt planned for the possibility of this day for a long time. It's hard to fathom how angry Nebuchadnezzar was when his authority was challenged, but reportedly his face turned red with fury. In response, he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than normal. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were tossed into the flames, the radiant heat was so great, the men carrying them were killed. No doubt, wearing flammable clothing, the faithful Hebrews had no hope, unless hope itself intervened. Daniel 3:19-25, New King James Version. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. The king, Nebuchadnezzar, was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." "Look," he answered, "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God." When Nebuchadnezzar saw the men walking around in the fire, not only did he find it unbelievable that they were unharmed, but he also found it unbelievable that there were 4 of them. The 4th appeared to be God's Son, implying that he was pre-incarnate Christ. Nebuchadnezzar tells us who the 4th person was: the Son of God. During the most difficult part of their ordeal, Jesus was there with them physically. Amid their ordeal in the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego may or may not have been aware that the Son of God was with them. Although there are times when we are conscious of Jesus' presence in our afflictions, and other times we are not, we should never doubt that he is present. God is able to strike with astonishment those individuals whose hearts are most hardened against him and his people. He that made the soul can make his sword to approach to it, even to that of the greatest tyrant. When the king realized that the men he had sentenced had been divinely rescued, he summoned them, and not a single hair on their head had been scorched in the process. Being thrown into Nebuchadnezzar's deadly fire had proven to be a piece of cake. Number 6. Asherah. Who was Asherah, or Ashtoreth? In the Bible, Asherah, or Ashtoreth, is the name of a pagan fertility goddess and a wooden cult object devoted to her. In the Bible, Asherah is almost always referred to as a sacred pole erected in honor of the fertility goddess. Scripture also references carved images of Asherah. The name Asherah means she who enriches. In Ugaritic literature, she was called Lady Asherah of the Sea. She was believed to be worshipped in ancient Syria, Phoenicia, and Canaan. She was worshipped by the Phoenicians as Astarte, the Assyrians as Ishtar, and the Philistines as Asherah. As soon as Joshua died, Asherah worship plagued Israel due to Israel's complicated conquest of Canaan. Judges 2:13. So they abandoned the Lord and served Baal, the pagan god of the Canaanites, and the Asheroth. The nation of Israel was in a state of compromise in Judges 1. Initially, they had fought the pagan culture of the Canaanites. Then they feared it, and then they coexisted with it peacefully. Some might say that this was only a little disobedience compared to everything God had commanded. Still, God does not consider minor disobedience regarding his precise commands. People are always called to be different by God. It was God's standard for Israel to be different from the nations around them, but they had not obeyed. Sin always hurts. It always shackles. Joshua had faith in God and believed in his promises. Because of the leadership of Joshua, his generation knew the Lord. However, generations come and go. The new generation didn't know God. The nation began with incomplete obedience and compromise. Instead of driving out the Canaanites, they were affected by that heathen nation's perverse pagan worship. Asherah was characterized by a limbless tree trunk planted in the ground. The trunk was typically carved into a symbolic representation of the goddess. As a result of the connection with carved trees, the places of Asherah worship were commonly called groves. He placed the carved Asherah pole he made in the temple among King Manasseh's evil acts. Considered the moon goddess, Asherah was often presented as a consort of Baal. Asherah was also worshipped as the goddess of love and war and sometimes linked with Anath, another Canaanite goddess. The cult of Asherah was notorious for its sensuality and involved ritual prostitution. In addition to this, divination and telling fortunes were also practices that the priests and priestesses of Asherah carried out. A detailed description of Asherah, or an Asherah pole, is not provided in the Old Testament, nor is the origin of Asherah worship described. In Canaan, sacred sites and altars were adorned with Asherah poles. 1 Kings 14:23. For they also built for themselves high places to worship idols, and sacred pillars and Asherim for the goddess Asherah. These were on every high hill and under every luxuriant tree. The city of Tyre on the Mediterranean coast was home to the best cedars of Lebanon and was an important center for worshipping Asherah. The Jewish law explicitly forbade reverence of Asherah. Deuteronomy 16:21. You shall not plant for yourself an Asherah of any kind of tree or wood beside the altar of the Lord your God, which you shall make. Judges 6:26 depicts the collapse of an Asherah pole by using it to fuel the fire of a sacrificial offering to the Lord. Judges 6:26. And build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this mountain stronghold, with stones laid down in an orderly way. Then take the second bull and offer a burnt sacrifice using the wood of the Asherah, which you shall cut down. A famous Asherah pole stood in Samaria in the days of King Jehoash. Manasseh, king of Judah, heeded the despicable practices of pagan nations. He reconstructed the high places and set up altars for Baal and the Asherah pole. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced sorcery and divination, and even made a carved image of Asherah and set it up in the temple. 2 Kings 21:7. He made a carved image of the goddess Asherah and set it up in the house, temple, of which the Lord said to David and to his son Solomon, in this house and in Jerusalem, in the tribe of Judah, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. During the reign of Josiah, the high priest Hilkiah cleansed the temple of all images depicting the goddess Asherah. One reason Israel fell to the Assyrians was God's anger over their worship of Asherah and Baal. Despite God's clear instructions, Asherah worship was a perennial problem in Israel. As Solomon slipped into idolatry, one of the pagan deities he brought into the kingdom was Asherah, called the goddess of the Sidonians. At times, Israel experienced a revival, and King Josiah led notable crusades against Asherah worship. Number 7. Dagon. Who was Dagon? The Bible describes Dagon, also known as Dagon, as one of the oldest deities in Mesopotamia, with evidence dating back to 3000 BC, and he was represented as a half-man, half-fish creature. The god Dagon was regarded as the father of all other gods, so he was worshipped widely in what we call the cradle of civilization, where farming is thought to have first started. Also the area some call the Fertile Crescent. Dagon's statue looked like a gigantic man. Some representations of him have him looking like a merman, which is a human with fish features below the waist. Some scholars have referred to him as a fish god, which makes sense given his association with the Philistines and their location along the coast. In the Bible, the Philistines continued to worship Dagon during the time of the Judges, as well as during the reign of Samuel and Saul. As a biblical connection, ancient texts from the region connect Dagon as the father of Baal, another false god highlighted throughout later Old Testament history. What happened to Dagon in the Bible? There are two primary messages in the Old Testament that make reference to Dagon. The story can be found in Judges chapter 16 as a component of the Samson narrative. God chose Samson to be one of the deliverers, or judges, and he used his renowned power to triumph over the Philistines at every stage of the conflict. The Philistines were unable to defeat him in combat, so they targeted his Achilles heel, his relationship with foreign women. The famed Delilah coaxed Samson's secret confession out of him and made him cut off his hair, leading to him being taken captive by the Philistines. As they worshipped Dagon and had a big party, they decided to humiliate Samson by putting out his eyes and making him work as a slave. Clearly, this was part of their worship of Dagon. When nations went to war in polytheistic cultures, it was also understood that their gods fought, and the Old Testament confirms this in many passages with Israel and other cultures. With Samson, the Philistines were making a statement. Due to the capture of Samson, they believed Dagon had beaten Jehovah, Samson's god, and therefore Dagon was stronger than the God of Israel. However, Samson made a plea to God and brought the entire structure down. Samson's plea to God to help him destroy the Philistines makes sense. God's assistance was not about Samson so much as proving which god was stronger. 1 Samuel 5 is where we find the next instance of Dagon being dealt with. The Philistines succeeded in stealing the Ark of the Covenant from its previous owners. In a manner identical to that which had occurred with Samson, the Philistines brought the Ark into the temple of one of their city-states, Ashdod. 1 Samuel 5, 1-7, Amplified Bible. Then the Philistines took the Ark of God and they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. They took the Ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it beside the image of Dagon, their chief idol. When the people of Ashdod got up early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face on the ground before the Ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and returned him to his place. But when they got up early the next morning, behold, Dagon had again fallen on his face on the ground before the Ark of the Lord, and his head and both palms of his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk portion of the idol of Dagon was left on him. This is the reason neither the priests of Dagon nor any who enter Dagon's house step on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. Then the hand of the Lord was heavy on the people of Ashdod, and he caused them to be dumbfounded and struck them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. When the men of Ashdod saw what happened, they said, "The ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is heavy on us, and on Dagon our God." As a mark of their success, they displayed the ark by placing it at the base of the massive statue of Dagon. Dagon had beat Jehovah, right? It didn't last long. Then they sent the ark to the city of Ekron. Yes, you guessed correctly. More people developed tumors and passed away as a result. The people of Philistia pleaded with their officials to return the ark to Israel, and their leaders complied with their request, pointing out that they shouldn't be as obstinate as Pharaoh had been in Egypt. They loaded the ark onto a cart that was driven by 2 animals, and then they set it out. The oxen eventually made it back to Israel, even though there was no one driving them. Despite the worldview of the Philistines, the defeat of Israel wasn't a defeat of their God. God didn't need the army of Israel to fight for him. He won all on his own. It seems as if God has a sense of humor when we read the story of Dagon in the Bible. Here, and in Isaiah, we see how God deals with false worship twice, when he speaks of cutting wood for a fire and then bowing down to it. In the Isaiah excerpt, God said, "He feeds on ashes, A deluded heart has led him astray, and he cannot deliver himself or say, "Is there not a lie in my right hand?" Dagon was worshipped in temples that could be found all over Mesopotamia. According to the Bible, the cities of Beth-dagon, Gaza, and Ashdod were home to some of the most important temples. He was worshipped by offering offerings and participating in feasts. His temple is destroyed, his image is laid prostrate before the ark of God, and with his hands and face cut off, demonstrating that he is powerless to resist the God of the Israelites, and his creature, which is a fish, complies with the will of God by swallowing and spitting out a prophet who is on his way to Dagon's people, to tell them to repent and turn back to the true God. We need to be cautious about what we allow to infiltrate our lives. The Bible doesn't really mention if the Israelites engaged in Dagon worship. However, we know they dabbled with Dagon's gods, Baal and Asherah, so we can assume they threw a little Dagon in there. The seemingly innocuous can turn out to be insidious, so we must exercise extreme